Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the weekly mailbox, your weekly chance to ask me questions about absolutely anything. A little bit later this evening, we usually do it midday, but I've been a little bit busy. Apologies. However, 5 awesome questions as always. Some unique questions this week. Don't get me wrong, I've enjoyed going through them, and as always, if you want to ask me questions for next week or a few weeks down the line, feel free to send questions on Instagram. I've already got a couple for next week's episode stored up. A few of you spoke to me on Instagram over the last couple of days, so don't worry, I've not been ignoring them. But also you can throw them in the comments below of this video or any video over the week. Not many questions about the front runners, however this week the midfield apparently was a giant talking point. The majority of questions this week were about the midfield, so I feel like we've got a bit of a midfield special going on this week. So hopefully you will sit back and enjoy. But let's crack on with question 1. Comes from BlueTube. Is Carlos Sainz Jr. really as good as his performances this year would show? Hot take. BlueTube, you're a spicy boy or gal. That is, that's going to cause some debate in the comments. So I've got to be careful with what I say. No, I never do that on this channel. Or is the car just making him seem like a far better driver than we saw in 2018? I picked this question for a reason, mainly because it was a very juicy question, and I thought it's probably going to stir up a little bit of debate. I'm currently at the moment re-watching Drive to Survive on Netflix, and it gives, not the best look into 2018, I don't personally think. Whilst I love the series, don't get me wrong, factually, it's over-dramatised, I think we can all agree with. If you didn't watch Formula 1 last year, you wouldn't be aware, but Carlos Sainz drove for Renault. He was a Red Bull young driver, and he took the gamble to go on loan to Renault, and the year wasn't brilliant. It was okay. However, Red Bull decided rather than bring back Carlos Sainz, they would promote Gasly, and Sainz, rather than going back to Toro Rosso, decided to move on to McLaren. Now, I've said many times, I think Sainz is in a perfect place, and I think for McLaren, having the lineup of Sainz and Norris is pin drop perfect, and that's something I definitely didn't expect heading into 2019. Do I think Sainz... The question here is, was Sainz underperforming last year, or is he overperforming this year? That's what it boils down to. And I don't think it's either. I think my personal opinion on this, which I think a lot of people will disagree with, but I don't mind saying it, I don't think Sainz was that bad last year. If you go back and look at my season ratings, I didn't rate Sainz that low. And whilst at the time a lot of people disagreed with me, when you actually look at the statistics, outside the top 3 teams, Carlos Sainz had the most points finishes of anybody. He got unlucky quite a few times with a few different incidents with different drivers. My man Romain Grosjean taking him out in Silverstone while he was in a points finishing position is the one that springs to mind. But Sainz last year I thought was really consistent. It was just that Hülkenberg was that step ahead and was the man getting those flashy results on weekends where the car was super good, and Hülkenberg was the better of the two. So I actually think last year, rather than Sainz being not as good or Sainz being too good this year, I just think he was a little bit underappreciated. Sticking with McLaren for question 2, coming from Louis. Do you think McLaren will switch back to the silver livery for 2021? This is a cool one, and mainly because, you all know, design in Formula 1 is one of my favourite things. Whether it's livery, the pre-season for me is peak. Love it when they launch the new cars, but also helmet designs. Love that as well. There's a few helmet pictures coming up a little bit later on in the video because I've always got to include one. This is the livery in 1999, the classic McLaren Mercedes, West David Coulthard, Mika Hakkinen, Kimi Räikkönen livery. I really like this one. This was the McLaren livery that was a little bit before my time. However, when I was a kid, always played the 2002 game. That was what I grew up on. So when I picked McLaren, I saw that one. This is the 2007 one, the Vodafone McLaren with the silver and red. However, as much as I think it'd be great to see McLaren go back to this livery. I don't think it's a part of their identity anymore. Because I think the key thing you have to remember with the 90s, with the early 2000s, is that, first of all, Mercedes wasn't on the grid as a works manufacturer team, but also, that's what McLaren were. They were the Mercedes work team, so Mercedes themselves pumped a lot of money into that team. So it practically was a Mercedes team, but it was also a McLaren team, a bit of a joint team, if you will. So that's why they were silver. Do I think they'll go back? Well, they didn't with Honda. They went with a completely new livery. They didn't go back to the white and red livery that we saw in the early 90s. So I don't see them going back either. Partner that with the fact the McLaren brand itself is road cars, the P1, the Senna, heavily based with orange colouring. I don't think they'll change it. I think they've got a real niche there, so I'm going to go with papaya orange. I'd love to know your thoughts, though, in the comments below. McLaren, though, a lot of McLaren theming today. They're fourth in the constructors, but the team trying to catch them is Renault. And Atul asks this question. He's come up with some really brilliant questions over the last few weeks, so thank you very much, mate. Why do you think Renault failed to meet their improvement expectations for this year? Deep question, my friend. Deep question. And I think I've got to put my hands up and say I'm definitely not expert enough within the Renault company to have any idea what the intricate, tiny little details have gone wrong in their operation. But I can have a guess, I can have a stab, and we can look at it from the bigger picture. So the big change at Renault this year was Daniel Ricciardo coming into the team. Carlos Sainz obviously left, he's gone to McLaren. We've spoken about him already plenty today. Daniel Ricciardo came in, a whopping fee. Again, we're not privy to the exact numbers, but it was a hell of a lot of money. One of the highest paid Formula 1 drivers on the grid, and it was a gamble to bring him into the team. I wouldn't say the car's gone backwards. Whilst the target this year very much was to be in the fight with Red Bull, and the idea was that it would be Mercedes and Ferrari first and second, and then Renault and Red Bull would fight each weekend for third and fourth. Of course, winter testing tells us a lot, and it tells us a lot of lies, I think it's fair to say. But I also think it's fair to say, and Atul's hit it perfectly, they would have loved the podium. I mean, there was a chance in Germany, but that's not on pure pace. So what do I think's gone wrong? I think McLaren have made a step forward, and that's really emphasised what's wrong within Renault. I imagine they will have another year like this next year and make a real push for 2021. I think Daniel Ricciardo coming into the team has taken up a lot of funds for a team that already is asking for more and not getting money. I just think they need a lot of money to be able to bridge that gap, and I think for them to do that, it's going to need a regulation change. So I think perhaps rather than they didn't achieve the targets, I think the targets were a little bit unrealistic, I personally think. Again, that's a bit of a hot take, plenty of those today, but I just think it was unrealistic to expect going from just beating Haas in fourth to then jumping up to the front of the grid, especially in modern Formula 1. But 2021, I'm quietly optimistic for Renault. And I think next year will be about bringing in Ocon, consolidating that driver lineup, just trying to be a little bit more consistent. Because I think even if you look at the results this year, at the beginning of the season, if they hadn't had the reliability issues, I think they'd be right there with McLaren. So the season's still not over, they could still finish fourth, but definitely not where they would have wanted to be. AS19 asks, which Formula 2 drivers in the current grid will end up in Formula 1, or will some point end up in Formula 1. I would like to say, I do fully believe that Antoine Hubert would have made it to Formula 1. At the beginning of the year, if you saw any of my Formula 2 videos, I praised that man so much, and before the season even started, I thought he'd be running in for the championship this year, and if what happened hadn't happened, I think he would have been in the running next year, and would have had a real good chance. The drivers, well, Nick de Vries is the champion this year with a race weekend to go. He's gone to Formula E. I think, a little bit like Van Dorn, I think he's more sensible to stay in Formula E than move to a potential back seat in Formula 1. Nicholas Latifi, the man that fought De Vries in the championship, he's Williams' reserve driver in 2019, and it looks like, and I do believe, he will be on the grid next season for Williams alongside George Russell. Experience out the window a little bit, but I think he will be in. A name I'm guessing you've all heard of, Mick Schumacher. I think he will also make it to Formula 1 one day. He's not ready yet. Some people believe he is, but I still think it's been a difficult year for him. But historically, and we discussed this in our junior programme video, he has a year just to get used to a championship and then a year where he does really well. So I expect next year to be a big step up from Schumacher. Jack Aitken. I know a lot of you love Jack Aitken. I'm not too sure. Don't get me wrong, I think he's just as good a driver, if not better, than the likes of Sergei Sorokin, the likes even potentially of Nicholas Latifi. I just don't see it opening. However, his counterpart in the Renault Young Driver Programme, Guanyan Zhou, I believe he's the highest placed rookie in the championship this year. I think he potentially could, especially if the likes of Ricciardo moves on and Ocon is pushed out of the team. Yeah, I can see them taking him. So they're the kind of drivers I'm thinking will move to Formula 1. Scott Barnes asks, hi Dan. Hi Scott. That was a bit cringy. Apologies. Do you think, who do you think is the most underrated midfield driver in Formula 1 2019? Would love to have your view on it. Thank you, Scott. I'm going to spin that back and say, you watching right now, I want to know your view on it. This is question 5, our final question. We always do audience participation, so in the comments below, who is the most underrated driver in the midfield? There's lots to go through, and underrated is a difficult one, I always say, because it's it's very opinionated, but more so on the fact who you personally think is underrated. Romain Grosjean, I think, a little bit underrated. 10 podiums in his Formula 1 career. More than Charles Leclerc. Just throwing that out there. I'm using that statistic while I can. Leave me alone. He's got 10. Leclerc's got 9. Grosjean, I think, is more well known for his crashes. But even at the end of last year, he wasn't that bad. But I've got to admit, it's definitely got worse over the last couple of years. Hulkenberg is one that sprung to mind when I was asked this question. This man was on fire last year. I don't think he's been much worse this year, and yet all the talk has gone from what a brilliant driver he is, the fact that he's been a top seat, to now that he potentially could be out of Formula 1, everyone's saying, well, he's had his chance, probably fair enough. I just find it quite funny how people's moods change. Pierre Gasly, likewise, he's doing really good things in the Toro Rosso since he's moved back. It was just that move to Red Bull, the car didn't suit him, the pressure didn't seem to suit him. But the man I'm going to go for is Kevin Magnussen. And it's a difficult one because I know most of you don't underrate Kevin Magnussen. It's me personally. And I wanted to lay my cards on the table. K-Mag, I don't give him enough credit sometimes. And over the last couple of years, I don't think it's been brilliant for K-Mag this year. But that car has been an absolute dog. He really has been a bit of a light for the team. He's a bit dirty with driving, but I always say this. We can't complain about dirty drivers or people that aren't particularly nice. I'm not saying Kevin's not particularly nice, but what he is a real character. And sometimes in Formula 1, you need those characters. And it's something that we lack a little bit sometimes in modern Formula 1. Although some of the rookies this year, I think are a good bunch of laughs. But I like Kevin Magnussen. And I think sometimes I'm a little bit harsh on him. And yeah, that's what I'm going to go with. But the likes of Kvyat, Perez, even Lance Stroll, I think you could say are underrated in certain situations. But that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Of course, I need your questions for next week. We're almost at episode 20. Might do a special something. I don't really know. I don't think that far ahead, to be honest with you. Anyway, if you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed, feel free to do so. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video, everybody. And I hope to see you in the next one.